Welcome to Module 10. We're going to take a little look at the content here so I can give you some items to watch out for as you're digging into the materials this week. First, at the beginning of the chapter is this prestige plastics. I call it a vignette. It's a little story of a situation about a bid that has come in and is being analyzed. And please read that. It will give you a really good example of why we need to look deeper into costs. It also deals with setup costs, or what can often be described as tooling costs. So it sets up a really interesting discussion. Then as you unwrap into the chapter, be thinking about how that applies to what we might do with prestige plastics. We'll talk about the actual situation at the beginning of class or during class when we're together next week. The chapter starts off and tees things up, I think appropriately, with this perspective of what I call the conditions of competition. And that is the reality that we often go into a procurement situation assuming that there is true competition. And I would define true competition being that there are 3 to 5 valid bidders available to us. At the far right is the monopoly. That's the situation where there really is not competition. There's really only a single valid provider, and we often call them the price maker because they can set the price however they want, and we'll be forced to take whatever they give us. At the end of the other end of the scale would be a pure or a market condition where we have lots of sellers. And basically the sellers then become the price taker, and they'll have to sell their product for whatever the market will bear. But in reality, we often live somewhere in between where competition is imperfect. There are some suppliers, but they're not all equal. When we're over here in oligopoly, that means that there are only a few, but there's more than one that can provide. And we're often somewhere in between. And I emphasize this because as procurement people, we often make the mistake of believing that monopoly and the existence of competition will ensure that the prices we receive are fair and reasonable. And I like that term, fair and reasonable. We don't want the cheapest, lowest price. We want to be able to have suppliers that provide high quality and want to actually perform the terms of the contract. But fair and reasonable means I'm not being ripped off. And even when there's competition, that's not always the case. Now, certainly if there's no competition, then you can bet we're going to probably be ripped off, or there'll be some lack of fairness in the process. But we can't just assume that because there's competition that we will receive a fair price. I would argue that regulation by competition is not a valid regulation of the market. We have to really understand the market. We have to understand what the costs are, and then what would be a reasonable price for us to work toward. And we might need to negotiate. So while there are almost two tracks you go down, where we might go out for a bid and we send the bid to 5 or 8 potential suppliers, and let's assume that all 8 send back their responses. Then we can just compare their bids and say, oh, here's the price of this one, here's what they're going to provide, here's the price of this one. And we could compare those and make a decision and award the contract. But that's really not a realistic approach. We may go out and get those bids to come back in, but none of them may come back in to be really fair and reasonable. And there's often what I would call money left on the table, where we need to look at those bids and maybe we should narrow them down to the best 2, or the 2 we're most likely to award to, and then negotiate with each of them separately and say, look, we really like your proposal, but what cost did you put into this? What margin are you charging us? What services are you assuming that we're going to need? Because if it's a service that you're charging me for, or you're including in your margin, and I'm not going to use that, I don't want to pay for it. So there's an opportunity often to negotiate the price lower than the bid that was provided. But that needs to be kind of communicated up front in the bid process to let them know that we want your best bid proposal. We want that to come in, but we will narrow it down. And if you don't make the cut, the conversation's over. We're gonna look at the best and have further negotiations. The downside of that is it sets a tone in the market that they don't need to give you their best offer. There'll be a chance later on to to give the best offer, and you often will get very unrealistic initial responses. So it's a give and take. I worked at one organization where we had a policy that we would not accept further negotiation. We called it first and final. So when you send your bid in, it better be right and it better be your lowest, because you're either going to get it or not get it based on that. I found that to be a really inappropriate policy, because the bidders all knew who they were, and so they all bid as high. And then we looked at them and went, oh, the lowest one is this, but we're still being ripped off. But we've already set the tone that we're going to only accept this. We're not going to go back out and negotiate. So we put ourselves really in a bad spot. So it's a real balancing act with this. Competitive price proposals, at least 2 qualified. I would argue that that would probably be more in the 3 to 5 level to really have a competitive pricing process. There's an assumption that proposals are responsive to what we really want, and that's often not the case. The supplier is assuming what we want, even if we spell it out in the bid. So the negotiation process is a time for us not to beat them down as much as it is to talk and to discuss and to understand what I wanted and what they're providing. So I would term negotiation not as a fight, but a discussion. There's an assumption that those suppliers each competed independently. It's against the law for them to collude. It's part of the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it happens. It happens intentionally, and it also happens accidentally when they just happen to know a lot about the other bidders and they know what they're going to bid, so they appropriately adjust their pricing. So we can't assume independence. The supplier submitting the lowest offer often does not have a fair of it. The supplier submitting the lowest offer does not have an unfair advantage over its competitors. These are assumptions. And again, this is something to look for in the vignette, where one of the suppliers has a clear competitive advantage over the others. And we need to make sure that that is taken into account. Lowest evaluated price is reasonable. That's the assumption. And again, all these assumptions need to be checked and validated. Historical prices, we often look back and say, well, what did we pay last time, in order to determine whether the price we are being bid right now is appropriate. And some questions we need to ask is, what's changed? Has the price of metals increased? Has the price of labor increased or changed? What's the exchange rate of the dollar? Were there one-time costs that have been paid and shouldn't be additionally charged through to us? Inflation, all kinds of things. Competition, are there new competitors? Are there less competitors? Has there been consolidation? So it's always good to start with where we historically have had our pricing, but we always have to ask these questions, just say what's changed, and then adjust that expectation appropriately. Cost analysis, the article Sower gets into that, provides us really good framework and start on that, but realizing that a cost analysis is a little different, where we're not going to just compare bids. That's a bid analysis. A cost analysis is where we're going to look at the item we're buying and break down what are the costs of that item. What is the labor that goes in? What are the materials that go in? What is the technology that goes in? What are the overheads that a supplier would potentially experience in that? What are the logistics costs of getting that item together? And so we want to cost the item up, just like the supplier hopefully has been costing it up. And we're going to use our own numbers. And if we come in and it should be a $40 valve and they come in at $120, then we're going to have some numbers to base it on and say, hold it, I know that's made of malleable iron, and I know this is the current price of malleable iron. Where did you come up with that? And so we can really hold their feet to the fire. The other part of this is that there's an assumption that suppliers are going to price their product, manufacturers particularly, are going to price their product based on the cost of their manufacturing, plus their overheads, plus some reasonable level of profit. And that would be the number they'd give us. But I find that to be rarely true. The price that the manufacturer is going to give us is going to be based on what he thinks I'm willing to pay. And I would much rather have figured out his costs and added that a reasonable level of profit. That's what I'm willing to pay. the manufacturer will often come in and say, well, I think what you're willing to pay is what the current market is, or where, you're not going to be able to get it any cheaper. And my answer is no, I want you to make a reasonable profit, but a reasonable profit. And the market may be overinflated. So the only way I can know that is to do this cost analysis. And it does require some effort on my part, but it's amazing how much of that data is available out on the internet and through the annual reports of these companies. We can figure out their overhead rate. We can figure out their cost of labor. We can make some reasonable estimates, and it can often surprise your supplier. If you don't do that type of work, then they have all the power because they have all the information. So some concluding remarks: when price analysis is not possible, that means comparing competitive reasonable bids, bid analysis, then you have to do cost analysis. And if you don't do your homework, then you're just trusting the supplier to do the right thing. That's not a good position to be in. All companies have hidden costs that often reside in overhead. Even when the supplier comes in with their cost breakdown and shows me, this is my materials cost, this is my labor cost, this is my overhead cost, we're going to want to talk about, hold it, your overhead rate is way high. Why is your competitor's overhead rate, which I've checked based on their annual report, why is yours 20% of labor and his is only 5% of labor? What's the difference? Are you inefficient? Am I paying for other customers who are inefficient? I'm not carrying the load for them. So we're going to really look deeply into that. And overheads are the catch-all, and that does not need to be accepted. So if the overhead is unreasonable, it needs to be pushed back and say, well, you're going to have to clean up your processes. I'm not paying for your inefficiency. So it's got to be dealt with. Supply professional needs to understand the cost systems, the overhead, and it's worth the homework that you do. So that's kind of what you're going to be looking for. So it is a little more complicated and nitty gritty. We're going to look at activity-based costing. We're going to look at target pricing. So there's some different approaches to this, but it's such a powerful tool that I want you to dig into it and really get your heads around it. The discussion board, there's an optional discussion board out there. So if you run into anything that looks contradictory or confusing, throw us a question out there, and please feel free to also monitor the discussion board and provide your own responses on that, and I'll weigh in as well. So good luck this week.